Hello. Welcome back to the channel. Let me ask you something before we go any further. If your income slowed down next month, not stopped, just slowed, how long before your life starts adjusting in ways you don't like? A delayed payment, a canceled plan, a quiet kind of stress you don't announce to anyone. Most people think recessions begin with headlines. They don't. They begin with small adjustments inside ordinary lives. And by the time it feels official, it's already personal. Right now, everything probably looks fine. Stores are open. Deliveries arrive. Salaries hit accounts. Markets fluctuate the way they always do. Politicians use careful language. Analysts debate whether growth is cooling or normalizing. Nothing feels like collapse. It feels stable, predictable, manageable. Your routines are intact, and routine is a powerful anesthetic. It makes structural fragility feel like permanence. The modern economy runs on expansion. Businesses borrow to scale. Consumers spend to keep demand alive. Governments intervene when momentum fades. Investors price assets based on expectations of future growth. On the surface, this system looks balanced. You work, you earn, you spend, you save. Companies produce, banks lend, markets allocate. It appears circular, self-sustaining, logical. And it is, under one condition. It only works if confidence continues. You spend because you expect income. Companies hire because they expect demand. Banks extend credit because they expect repayment. Governments stimulate because they expect recovery. Expectation becomes oxygen. Remove it slowly, and the system doesn't explode. It tightens. Recessions rarely begin with panic. They begin with hesitation. A company delays expansion. A hiring plan gets postponed. A lender tightens standards slightly. Consumers shift from discretionary purchases to essentials. Nothing dramatic, just caution. But caution spreads. Because one person's reduced spending is another person's reduced income. There's a pattern that shows up before nearly every contraction, but it doesn't scream. It whispers through financial plumbing most people never look at. For example, long-term interest rates sometimes fall below short-term rates, a yield curve inversion. That sounds technical, but the meaning is simple. Investors expect weaker growth ahead. They expect the future to pay less than the present. Historically, that inversion has preceded most modern recessions. Not immediately, not theatrically, but consistently. It's not magic. It's expectation shifting. At the same time, consumer spending, the engine of many economies, begins to soften. Not collapse. Soften. Credit card balances rise while real purchasing power tightens. Households stretch to maintain lifestyle. Debt fills the gap between income and expectation. It still looks functional. Restaurants are still full. Flights are still booked. But the composition changes. More borrowing. Less cushion. Corporate earnings start compressing. Margins shrink under higher costs or weaker demand. Hiring freezes quietly replace hiring sprees. Layoffs begin in specific sectors and get framed as restructuring. Markets may even rally temporarily, pricing in hope that central banks will intervene. Policy responses enter the picture. Interest rate hikes to fight inflation or cuts to stimulate slowing growth. And here's where fragility sharpens. Policy operates with delay. Tightening often continues after damage has begun. Easing often arrives after confidence has already cracked. This is the hidden dependency. The system depends on precise timing from institutions you do not control. It depends on global supply chains functioning smoothly. It depends on geopolitical stability. It depends on credit remaining available. It depends on households not reaching their borrowing limits at the same time. Your stability is layered on top of these conditions. You may feel independent, but your income, your assets, even your rent are tied to expansion continuing somewhere in the chain. And when expansion stalls, the failure mode isn't theatrical at first. It's selective. Construction slows. Startups struggle to raise capital. Companies with high debt loads refinance at worse terms. Adjustable rate payments rise. Asset prices wobble. People who bought at peak valuations feel exposed. Then employment adjusts. Not everywhere. Just enough to change sentiment. And sentiment is contagious. This is where many people misunderstand recessions. They imagine them as accidents, as storms that appear without warning. But historically, the signals accumulate. Inverted yield curves. Tightening credit. Slowing consumer momentum. Asset bubbles stretched by cheap money. Policy miscalculations that assume resilience longer than reality allows. Each on its own looks manageable. Together, they form a pattern. And when contraction finally becomes visible, it feels sudden. But it was structural. Beyond the individual level, recessions redistribute power. Businesses with strong balance sheets acquire weaker competitors. Investors with liquidity buy distressed assets. Households without savings absorb the shock. Milestones get delayed. Home purchases, family plans, career moves. An entire generation can recalibrate its risk tolerance based on one severe downturn. Wealth gaps widen not because collapse was universal, but because fragility was uneven. This is why stability must feel conditional. The paycheck works if the company's revenue holds. The company's revenue holds if consumers keep spending. Consumers keep spending if income remains stable and credit remains available. Credit remains available if lenders trust repayment and policy remains supportive. Remove one layer and pressure transfers downward, usually toward the individual. If you've made it this far, take a second and subscribe to the channel. Not for optimism, not for reassurance, but because understanding patterns early is different from reacting late. And most people only look for explanations after the impact. Here's the realization that unsettles people. Recessions are not rare glitches in an otherwise perfect machine. They are part of the cycle. Expansion stretches risk. Cheap credit encourages leverage. Optimism inflates valuations. Eventually, something tightens. Rates rise, demand cools, debt burdens surface, and the system corrects. Not because it failed to function, but because it functioned exactly as designed during the boom. It isn't breaking. It's resetting. And resets don't ask who feels ready. The warning signs are rarely hidden. They're dismissed, reframed, debated, because acknowledging them would require acting before discomfort is obvious. It would require accepting that growth built on leverage carries conditions. It would require admitting that personal stability is linked to forces beyond personal discipline. So the question isn't whether recessions have triggers. History shows they do. The question is whether you recognize the pattern while your options are still intact, or only after adjustment becomes unavoidable. When the next contraction fully arrives, and it will, because cycles don't disappear, do you think you'll recognize the signals early? Or will it feel, like it does for most people, sudden?